broadcasting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hi, everybody. Please start introducing yourself in the chat function. Let us know, of course, who you are, where you are zooming in from, and let's start the conversations as soon as you enter the chat. Again, let us know where you're coming from. Introduce yourself to each other in the chat. I'm seeing faculty members, I'm seeing students, I'm seeing alum. Okay, so let me begin. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the many participants in this, the first webinar of the Schulich School of Business series, Shaping the Future of Business. My name is Marcia Anizet. I am the Associate Dean Academic. I'm also a professor of accounting at the school. I think it is fitting that the first topic of our series is embedding climate risk management into strategy and organizations. For I think that there is now, certainly in business circles, a consensus that climate risk is at best a catastrophic threat and at worst an existential threat. So here to discuss the topic is Alan Smith, a friend of mine from more than, should I say how long, Alan?
Please don't.
Let's just say more than 3 decades. Alan is currently Senior Advisor of Climate and ESG Risk Management at HSBC. To give you a little bit more of Alan and his career, Alan has been at HSBC for over 25 years in a variety of senior corporate and investment banking, finance, risk and capital management roles in London, England, as well as in Saudi Arabia. Currently, Alan is a member of HSBC's Climate Business Council, whose remit is to develop the group's sustainable finance, business and risk management strategy. He attends HSBC's ESG Steering Committee, which provides oversight of ESG across the group. Alan is a fellow of the Institute Chartered Accountants of England and Wales. And prior to HSBC, he worked with KPMG London, where he trained and qualified as a chartered accountant. Alan has an MBA in finance from the Cass Business School, City University of London. He is originally from Barbados in the Caribbean, close to where I'm from, Trinidad. And I think I just want to share a little tidbit about Alan, one that is not there in his official bio, but one which I think would endear him even more to this audience. And that is the fact that had Alan not chosen accountancy as a career, he would have been a world-renowned West Indian batsman, having shown amazing talent in the sport as a young man. So we might have been talking to Alan today about cricket and leadership. Since that is not the case, let's talk about the important topic, climate. So over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Marcia, and thanks for that wonderful introduction. And above all, for this real privilege to be speaking to you all today. It's interesting. I'm here in London, England. Earlier this morning, I was on a call with part of my team based out in Hong Kong, and actually, it's almost as if this afternoon is my Canada part of the day, because just before coming on to you, I was in a meeting and a call with someone who works with our offices in Vancouver. So very much, in many ways, that is fitting because in terms of climate risk and what we're going to be talking about that I'm going to be reflecting on, but hopefully as we get into the Q&A, it will be as much a discussion, and I'm looking forward to your questions, is really looking at climate and climate risk management as affects organizations wherever we are in the world. Because as Marcia said earlier, it is now one of the defining issues of our generation, as a risk to manage, also an opportunity to take hold of on the other side of that risk. And for us, in whatever sphere we're leading, obviously from a business school perspective, we think initially of corporate leadership, but that may be in all other spheres of leadership, in NGOs, in civil society. Climate risk is the game-changing challenge for us as business leaders. And so what I really wanted to go through in the talk is actually reflecting on that. How do we embed it into strategy and operations and organizations? And I wanted to cover off a few things, just reflecting on it, what its impact is going to be, and therefore what it is calling in terms of an urgent need for action. What are the opportunities and risks that it's posing? And I think we need to look at both sides of the equation, even though the risks are potentially existential. What then become the strategic and business model considerations that we need to think about as we are embedding it and thinking of embedding it looking forward from 2020? Bringing it home to how we manage it as risk managers, as financial managers around disclosing it. And then finally, just by way of a case study to reflect on, a couple of weeks ago, we globally put out our climate ambition to start our journey on how we want to take it forward for the next decade, and almost throw that out there as a reflection of how one organization is starting that journey around embedding it into strategy and operations. But moving to the first one, and I'm sure many of you would have seen this graph here, and for people like me who kind of did physics only up to O levels, which is kind of, for those of you coming from a Canadian system, maybe up to the age of 15 or 16, this graph, which is very much out there in defining climate change, which is showing the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere over the last 400,000 years, from pre-industrial, the pre-industrial era up to today, says it all. Because that precipitate rise in the last, few decades is changing everything. As you can imagine, and you situated in Canada, I think will be as rare as this as anywhere else, that we live in finely balanced ecosystems. Climate is, or the climate that we live in, which supports all level of life, of economic activity, is finely balanced. And when the level of carbon dioxide goes beyond that particular threshold, and in particular that inexorable rise that we're seeing, that is changing many things, but in particular, it's changing the balance in the climate, in particular with regards to the average temperature. A lot of it, as I said, driven by how we live, we consume, we get our sources of energy. And that plays out into this next graph, which is the way in which the carbon dioxide is going into the system, and given, and I'm sure many of you would have heard of the greenhouse effect, is actually causing the average temperatures to rise above pre-industrial levels. It's already about 1% above pre-industrial levels. And actually, because carbon dioxide stays in the system for so long, what we've already put in is already setting us on a trajectory, so that actually, if we continue to do what we do, it's going to carry us to 4 degrees. So if we continue consuming and generating our energy in the way that we're doing, it's going to carry us to 4 degrees. We'd have all heard of the Paris Accord, where everyone, we put in their pledges to try and reduce carbon emissions to bring us back to a 2-degree world or beneath that. And but actually we need to do more. And why that is significant is that if the average temperature rise, and I use that word average deliberately because that average will not be consistent across the world. Some areas will go at average temperature rises will go to a greater degree, increase to a greater degree than others. In that space between 1.5 and 2 degrees, and actually above 2 degrees, there are many aspects of the physical ecosystem which will break down in ways, whether it's food chains, supply chains, temperature rises going above a particular level. So our normal ways of economic activity will be significantly disrupted, means that we need to think how we address that aspect of emissions to make sure that the temperature rises is kept to 1.5. I mean, some people use the mantra 1.5 to stay alive as something to concentrate the minds of the need to mitigate the emissions that we're and adapt in a way that we're putting emissions into the atmosphere to bring it back within those levels to maintain stability. And so when you hear a lot of the terms like a 2-degree world or 1.5-degree world, this is what is driving it. And in particular, when we hear the terms like net zero emissions, which again are really an important part of the conversation, that a lot of that is how do we change our actions? How do we change the way in which we consume energy, generate energy, live our lives that make sure that we mitigate the temperature rises to within that level. And if you sit and unpick that, that is game changing and all pervasive. In order to do that, because if you look at that trajectory of going to 4 degrees if we do nothing, and even with the Paris Accord pledges from 2015, that's still going to leave us quite above where we need to get to. And it's that need for action as a result of what the science is telling us and the impacts that it will have in terms of, as I said, breakdown in many areas, that is driving action more widely, and for us as leaders in whatever sphere we need to look at it to take action. And we're already seeing people taking action across all spheres. So this kind of summary graph already looks within the last few years how many of the key stakeholders have been doing that, whether it's governments, investors, civil society, corporations, or even the markets themselves. So we've seen the way in which governments are taking action. Actually, just here in the UK, just yesterday, the Prime Minister announced a 10-point plan about how he's planning to transform and shape the economy to transform towards a greener economy. We've heard about how with President-elect Biden in the US, how much climate has come to the forefront, so much so that he's talking about his administration being a climate administration. That's happening on the government side. On the regulator side, we here in England are regulated by the Bank of England, but actually, ironically, previously under the leadership of Canadian, someone was previously the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney, has taken the lead in driving regulation alongside the support of the kind of government initiatives on that, and that will only increase. Investors and the number of investors who've signed up to this have kind of increased fourfold in the last 3 years, and that number will only increase in terms of what is called the Climate Action 100 group that is pushing to make sure that people are aware on top of the issue. Civil society, we've all seen it, whether it's Greta Thunberg, Sir David Attenborough, Extinction Rebellion, and all other manners of campaigning groups are very much at the fore in driving and holding corporations to account, holding governments to account to make sure that they're acting on it. Companies themselves, in the Fortune 500 over the last 3 years, the number of companies who have signed up in one way or another to sign up to a temperature alignment commitment and a reduction of emissions commitment has gone up almost 15 times. And then we're already beginning to see market solutions. The sustainable finance market, the green bond market, the assets under management with an ESG focus are all growing and have all been multiplying in size. So the game is changing and it's accelerating, as we've seen in the last 3 years. And it's accelerating and it's creating both opportunities and risks as we transition to this low carbon economy. And I think that is really important. Quite understandably and reasonably, we have to have that sense of urgency around the risks, because the risks, in particular, if we are persuaded by the science that there is something pivotable and irreversible when temperature rises go beyond that certain level, the risks are risks that we must address. But on the other side, there are opportunities in addressing them. And if you think on the opportunity side, that whole transition, and if you think of what that transition will mean in terms of shifts in to the low carbon economy, in terms of new business models to drive, say, renewable energy, new products to meet that, the new areas around clean tech to be driving that, the opportunities are immense. What I find interesting, and this is coming as a banker, coming as an accountant, who deals in numbers. One of the things which I find fascinating as people are having the discussion around the level of investment that is necessary is that people are talking in trillions. We normally hear people talking about millions and billions, but they talk about trillions, about the level of investment over the next decade and in that and those following decades out to 2050 to help shift to the low carbon economy. So the opportunities are immense, alongside the very, very real risks that need to be addressed, and the risks of rapid declines in asset value, and stranded assets as we change to and transition away from fossil fuels, through to the real and present danger of increased physical destruction and economic disruption from extreme weather patterns. We only need to look at this year's hurricane season and actually how they've been over the last decade to reflect on that. Marcia, talked about both of us coming from the Caribbean originally, and for us, climate change is not 2050. Climate change is 2000 or before, when you've seen these more intense hurricanes coming as a result of higher ocean temperatures on the back of higher global temperatures. And that reality and the physical risks that poses, and the way in which that plays back into to the economy and jobs and lives and risks, there again another dimension of the risk. There's the increased risk of needing to comply with regulation and disclosure. There's increased investor expectation, and there's the brand and reputational damage risks that go alongside all of the others above, that are rising from this need to adapt and move and transition, and will affect those who don't act or aren't able or are not aware enough as part of that process. So again, this gives a sense of how the need to address climate change, to be involved in the transition, creates real opportunities and risks for us as leaders and people in business or in any organization that we need to address. And it immediately poses questions for us in our leadership that we must ask. How does what we need to do define how we articulate our brand, our ambition, our targets? You know, what stance do we want to have around climate change and emissions and sustainable finance? How do we want to align ourselves towards that pathway to get to net zero? Um, what will we use to help us get there? How will we measure ourselves to help us get there? Um, how are we aligning with what is happening on a national level to get there? So yesterday, for example, here in the UK, the government brought forward by 10 years the period in which they want to phase out moving from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. And so again, that is going to change how we need to look as a business, or indeed any single business needs to look um, at it, or indeed on an individual level, what car you buy next. So it shows those kind of questions which you normally ask in our boardrooms, in our planning meetings, are very much at the fore, strategically and in the targets and ambitions that we have for ourselves, and also for the business models that we'll need to have. You know, how will we shape our business model to reflect that? How will we um, deal with the need to address that transition? Will we need to restructure? Will we need to build up capabilities in certain areas? There's a friend of mine that was working with a major energy company where that company has actually demerged and split its kind of fossil fuel arm from its kind of consulting services arm. And one of the reasons which drove that was the contemplation that the way in which the fossil fuels will need to engage will be very different from the kind of consultancy services arm, engineering services, project management services arm. And that almost in terms of long-term value realization for overall shareholders and shareholders in both businesses, that that corporate business model split was essential even from now. And that's a decision which has been made in 2019, 2020. That's not one to come. So again, these are, the change to as we move to this low carbon world, to net zero world, even from now is posing the kind of strategic and business model questions that we need to be asking and answering and acting on. It's also going to make us look at risk management questions. As I said, because climate risks translate into real financial risks to be managed. And standing back, there are broadly two high-level categories of risk that climate change is driving. There's the transition risks. So the fact that policy, regulation, technology, consumer preferences in their change to address the move to a low carbon world will be changing how business and households will be setting up and operating and acting. And so therefore, from a business perspective, but even from a financial institution perspective, those transition risks will create risks in terms of how we look at our customers, how we have to do business, how we need to measure them. So there's that one category of transition risks to be managed. The second one is physical risks. So the fact that actually, if we do nothing or we do very little or we're very slow in mitigating the level of emissions into the economy, um, everything that the science is telling us points to more intense um, climate and weather events. You know, whether it's rising temperature, greater precipitation through the change weather patterns, rising sea levels, and it's both chronic and acute changes in physical risk. That those risks are already you know, are almost the second category of climate-related risk that we need to manage. So again, whatever institution, whether it's in my day job as a financial institution, but actually any institution in the world needs to start thinking of risk and risk management in this way, of how those two foundation categories of risks, transition risk and physical risk, will potentially impact your business, your customers, your operations, your infrastructure, your plan, and then understand how you identify and then manage, measure, and mitigate those risks. And again, in a similar vein, you need to be asking a similar set of questions around similar set of risk management questions. What's your risk appetite? What's your climate risk appetite? So just as you'll have a risk appetite statement around all other risks, what's your climate risk appetite? What's your materiality level? So for example, let's go back to physical risks. If you have a certain amount of your plant in areas that may be susceptible to wildfires as a result of changing temperature or rising sea levels and floods in a particular um, in particular areas, what is your kind of risk tolerance for running those risks, or what are the actions that you'll be need to be taking to mitigate that, given how the fact that these risks are likely to increase. But that even from now, really important to be building in these risk management questions and considerations. And alongside that, the bringing it in not just to risk management, but into our accountability and governance and culture, and the training and learning mindset within our organizations that's going with this. Where is climate risk being managed and understood within the organization? To what extent at all levels, from the board right through to all levels in the organization, are people having that awareness and being kept on top of that awareness? Who is accountable? What are the incentives schemes being put in place to promote and reward the proper value creation, and actually just the proper values around climate? You know, again, how does it fit into your control framework, your risk management framework? All of these, again, real questions because of how things are changing, that business leaders, risk managers should be asking from now. And because it's essential to be really having important building blocks, even as you ask those questions, to make sure that you do that effectively. Um, and we look at of a framework of 4 building blocks, and actually it's partly shaped through within our regulatory framework. But these 4 building blocks of looking at it from a risk management from a governance perspective, from the active risk management perspective, from scenario analysis, and from disclosures. How do we govern it? Who owns what where around climate risk? Through to risk management, how are we building the tools, in particular along temperature alignment, to make sure that we are doing it in a robust manner? Scenario analysis, and I'll come into another bit of it, a really important building block. And just disclosures, not just from understanding the risk to yourselves, but also being accountable to the market on it. But even as we ensure that we build the risk management capabilities, these 4 building blocks of governance, risk management, scenario analysis, and disclosure, essential. And if it was one of those tools that I'd like to call out in particular, it's scenario analysis. If we go to the view that we must take actions now to make sure that we keep the average temperature increase to below to 1.5 degrees by 2050, which therefore means that we have to have net zero emissions into the atmosphere between now and 2050. Everything is about having an understanding of what the next 30 years will look like. And the way in which we do that will be via scenario analysis. So scenario, and again, it's something which people do to varying degrees in varying industries. Some people do it less than others. Some people just view it as a crystal ball type exercise. But actually, to actively manage and properly understand and start acting, whether it's from a commercial perspective or risk management perspective, I can't emphasize how important it is that that discipline of building scenarios to think about what may be ahead is important, because it drives a discipline for how we begin to think about over that period. Because you know we need to be taking decisions today for those next 30 years, and we need to do that in a very rigorous, challenging way. And it isn't there's going to be one scenario that fits all. So even in the case here and what I have in front of the slide here, actually these are three of the scenarios that we have to consider next year for a stress testing exercise that we have to run for our central bank. And they kind of look at through the kind of early policy action, which is that people having realized the need, kind of policy action moves in tandem and in a coordinated way um, to, 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 to get towards the keeping temperature rises below that the 2 degree level and tending towards 1.5 degrees. Um, there's then the fact that we kind of spend the next decade not doing much and arguing and not taking some of the actions, but then realizing come 2030 that to really keep stuff below to keep the temperature rises below 2.5 degrees, there'll then be a real steep increase in action after that. So late policy action, and then no action. That what we've gotten agreed to so far, no further action is taken. And again, that brings out the balance between physical and transition risks. Um, and and these are three scenario narratives, as I said, that are off the shelf from our regulators for us. But actually, for each organization in each locale, there'll be variations for that. There'll be different views, but it is really, really important to manage to manage the risk, to understand the risks, to be building that scenario capability. If it's one thing, even as I go back to to that theme of embedding it into strategy and operations, that ability to build a scenario analysis mindset into how we run our businesses is going to be essential. Indeed, that's even how we run our lives. Then there's disclosures, and we're already seeing how important it is, the need to, as we are finding out and disclosing more about and understanding more about climate, and also as we are held to account more by climate, that the disclosure framework, what we understand and disclose to the market and actively monitor internally and externally, is another key capability and process to embed. I mean, and even now we notice it. A couple of years ago, and a lot of this has been driven by the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosure, the TCFD, which, while originally almost voluntary and adopted by firms, just again last week, the UK Treasury Minister, Chancellor of the Exchequer, has signaled that he'll be making it mandatory for firms in the UK to be disclosing by 2025. But even before that, when if I go back a couple of years ago, when we had rating agency meetings or meetings with any of our investors, they would talk about general performance trends, other aspects of your strategy. Increasingly now, there is not a rating agency meeting, there's not a major investor meeting that you're not challenged on things around what are you doing around climate, what are your TCFD disclosures? How are you going to tell us more about it? So again, and while that has started for us in the financial sector, that necessity to disclose not only drives an important financial management discipline, it's also a very important discipline in how we're accountable to the market, but also helping drive the market-based processes that go along all of the other processes in helping us address climate change and manage the transition. And I then also like to bring all of it together into us at HSBC, which, you know, if you sit back and reflect, we're one of the world's largest banks. We're in 67 countries. Our balance sheet is about 2.7 trillion, give or take. And 2 weeks ago, we announced our climate ambition, which is our commitment and our responsibility and our need to be playing our role and playing a very important role around the climate, both in terms of how it shapes us and how we interact with our customers, the economies that we operate with, or our various stakeholders. And so this slide here, and actually there's a bigger and wider presentation on our investor page, which our CEO and head of sustainable finance business gave a couple of weeks ago on this. But this actually on one page seeks to think how we are seeking to bring it all together and to define it for us as an organization. So setting out those kind of three high level aspirations and ambitions, that we become a net zero bank, that we support our customers in that journey, and that we unlock the new climate solutions to help us get there, as kind of the three overall strategic ambitions and pillars. And then coming down within each of those columns, what are the objectives that we set to make sure that we achieve them? And then how will we be using the tools to get there? What are the tools that we're using to get there to help us to become a net zero bank, to support our customers to unlock new climate solutions? But again, as a case study, and having to take that first step to address all of these powerful drivers as to why we're addressing climate change, this kind of one page for us as a big global organization is how we're seeking to capture it. That's the start of the journey. Believe you me, we're at the start of the journey, and a very long journey rather than the end of it. But in a similar way, if I can throw that, it's not just telling our story, but actually maybe for all of you on the call, wherever you are, organizational wise, but actually maybe even on a personal level, what is your equivalent one pager which defines how you will be addressing climate change strategically? And so I'd like to maybe leave it there before then open up to questions. That climate change is the defining opportunity and risk management challenge for business leaders, and actually leaders full stop of this generation. It has real opportunities and real risks. You know, they're wide-ranging strategic and business model implications. Those who will be successful will be putting in place the strong risk management and disclosure disciplines that are going to be essential. What is also essential is to embark on the journey now, even if we don't have all of the answers, because it is such an imperative. It really is important to start now. I hope that my reflections has given you a sense of that urgency and how we should all be thinking about it. And just would really like maybe just to leave it there and say thanks so much for the opportunity to share it, and just really know just to open it for your questions or perspectives. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan, for what I think was an extremely comprehensive presentation on climate change and its risks, opportunities, and best practices for risk management. Yes, we are opening up to the Q&A, and I will invite all participants to use the Q&A feature rather than the chat feature to post your questions. So as participants start posting their questions, Alan, I will start the ball rolling. With perhaps something that might be a very naive question, certainly to a practitioner, but I look in your title, and let me just remind myself what your title is. You are the advisor of climate and ESG risk management. And I wondered, why did they separate climate from ESG, if this is an industry practice, or if is this just a nuance of HSBC?
I'll tell the truth and the truth. Well, the first one is when my boss asked me to write my own job title, I wanted to put climate within it explicitly. But actually unpicking it in reality, and you've actually asked a very important question. Climate is really a subset of ESG. So the environmental, social, and governance. Climate is a subset of the E within ESG. So because and the environmental, which covers a whole range of aspects from climate to biodiversity to wider environmental aspects. But in my case, and actually in our case, given the imperative of climate, from a job title perspective, that's why we put it there. But actually, in a strict framework perspective, climate is a subset of ESG. It's a subset of the E of ESG.
Okay.
But increasingly, the three are interlinked in how they need to play out. So for example, climate is having profound effects on social aspects. As you'll find, those who are excluded from wider aspects are actually disproportionately impacted by climate. Both between kind of emerging and developed world, but actually even within developed economies, you'll find, for example, that communities of color are disproportionately affected by climate impacts and environmental impacts, even within developed economies today. So that again brings the link between how the E and the S hang together.
Mm-hmm. I'll ask a follow-up, and then I will start reading from the chat, because I read in the news just yesterday, because we can't forget that we're in a pandemic, right? And so I read in the news yesterday that due to the repercussions of the pandemic and the subsequent economic downturn, that institutional investors are deprioritizing ESG. So it was there in the Financial Times. It said 95% of Canadian institutional investors are deprioritizing it. So I guess the question is, do you see this affecting sort of the current priorities of climate risk? I'm remembering that slide that you have there. I guess, in other words, will there be a softening of some of the actions by these important stakeholder groups that you pointed out?
It's interesting that you said that, and that has been one perspective. How I've seen it has actually been the complete opposite, in that you've actually seen that COVID has concentrated the minds. COVID has made people realize that you can have systemic breakdown in quite profound ways. That bad stuff can happen all over the world at the same time due to a common cause, and to some extent, it's concentrated the minds of the need to really bring out the fact that we need to be in that our whole ecosystem or economic system is in a very fine balance, and that it's quite vulnerable. And so and so it's made people reflect on climate in that way. So that's one thing where the COVID impact has given deeper reflection. Secondly, it has and as a result, I think it's speeded up the need to do it. I mean, there's one view, and it's definitely a personal view, that what COVID has done to the economy and to lives, and severe and devastating as it is, will be nothing compared to what climate dislocation will do. It might almost seem to be trite to say that COVID is a picnic compared to what climate would do. But I'm just saying that not to be facetious, but actually to bring out how much and how much is at stake here. And I think people have got that realization, so it's accelerated the focus on climate. A third one is that actually, because so much economic value has been destroyed as a result of climate as a result of COVID and its various impacts on economies, and as governments and actually paradoxically, it's impacted some of the industries that would have been linked to some of the debates around climate and fossil fuels, say the aviation industry, the travel industry, that as governments are having to re-stimulate economic activity, it's actually making governments look at that in a way which is climate friendly. So you hearing people talking about building back better, or the Green New Deal, or even the UK government's plan yesterday, which has put climate very much at that, both from a point of view not just of the need to have that transition to a low carbon world, but actually realizing it's one of the growth areas to stimulate economies um, in the post COVID world. So that is again a third one. And then last but not least, ESG funds, based on the kind of limited many ESG funds in this period since COVID have been some of the best performing ones.
Okay.
So while you're right, there's something which says the priorities of COVID mean all hands on the deck in addressing that. Those kind of four trends I have articulated there are things which are, to my mind, in terms of how I've seen it, accelerated the focus.
Okay, well, that gives me a sense of comfort. I'm seeing quite a number of questions in the chat here. There is Arnav, who's asked about 4 or 5 questions. I'll just go to one of his questions, because again, it comes to the same fear that I think a number of us have as to, there's virtue signaling, there is greenwashing, to what extent this is going to be real. So Arnav's, one of his questions is, and it related to a slide that you spoke to, reputational damage. So I'll read the whole question. Brand and reputational damage are one of the risks of transitioning to low carbon economy. Oh, it's just disappeared. Hold on, it's moved up. Let me just see if I can find it again. Right. Would this affect corporate giants the same way as local businesses? For example, Nike or Apple, I'm sure, are some people who, there are people who would look past the fact that these giants aren't following ESG framework. So basically, Arnav is saying, will this reputational damage be even in terms of customer responses, largely?
You know what? Maybe not at the start, but I think it will be, given the groundswell of what is happening. It would be an unwise corporation to say that I will just muscle through the not listening to it.
Right.
No, and so Arnav, you're right. In the short term, you're right. Some people's brands will have such power, or some people's business models historically will have such power, that they will think that they can take a dent on it and it won't be noticed. But my perspective and my experience is that because people realize that this is existential, that the way in which market forces, civil society forces are moving in this way is forcing corporations of whatever size to listen. And that's why if you look at, again, if I go back to that slide where, where I showed the trends over the last 3 years, the number of Fortune 500 companies that have made those pledges has gone up almost 15-fold. Those are some of the biggest corporations in the world, you know. And so that's how I look at that one.
Okay. I see an interesting question here from Somia. And Somia says, I was reading in an article that we currently try to change the monetary policies to help curb the climate change. But it's actually the fiscal policies that need to be changed at a global level and maybe even in tandem. Could you shed any light on this? I know you're not an economist, Alan.
It's funny. Well, and that's where, and 'cause there's also a very interesting question there which asks about the Paris Accord, the US government. You're right, it takes a combination of ones. What has been very interesting, and I guess we've seen it here in I guess we in the UK have to thank you guys in Canada, because it was it was your kind of Canadian-born governor of the Bank of England who has led on that. But it's interesting how it's come in that it's using monetary policy and prudential central bank policy, and realizing that financial sector stability could be impacted by climate change, that you actually found it's starting out. And I said not even totally in monetary policy, but actually prudential policy, if I can make that distinction.
Mm-hmm.
But what is happening, and as I said, and you can reflect in terms of what happened yesterday with the UK government, that which was fiscal policy or signaling of fiscal policy, and I would encourage you to look at kind of the UK government's 10-point plan. Is actually is government fiscal policy beginning to move in that direction, and I think what is also worth looking is even the Biden articulation of what the administration will be. But it's interesting to reflect how in the last couple of months, or even the last couple of weeks, the or days, by people talking about the Biden administration seeking to be a climate administration. So again, you're beginning to see where that while the journey from a governmental agency perspective, regulatory agency, as I said, not even came from a monetary perspective, but from a prudential perspective, you're beginning to see the fiscal actions coming. And that's very important, because a lot of these are fiscal actions which ultimately, because they impact how we should be looking at it, should be driven by governments. The other one significant one in the last couple of months, which is really of profound importance and maybe not as noticed, was within the last month or so, um, the Chinese government signaled their commitment to align to net zero by 2060. And so again, so if you sit back and think of some of the more, and that's before even talking about the European Union kind of pledges and commitments on that. So you're seeing how it's coming into fiscal policy quite quickly in very important ways.
Okay, I'm going to move from the macro to the micro. I see Nishant has asked a question. What are the biggest roadblocks for organizations as they look to implement newer measures to meet their climate relevant targets?
Data, and data. Is one, and then I'd say mindset. But if I can go on data first, one, and if I look at my personal journey, I'm having to go back to physics and chemistry that I left at the age of 16, or sometime give or take, before I decided to become an accountant. But you're having to get the data to help make decisions which are ultimately driven by how do we get to an average net zero temperature in 2050? So one of the big micro level things is just getting the data, but understanding and having the capabilities around that. So it is one of the micro level ones. And I think the other one is a mindset that we need to be, that ultimately we, in a world which is relatively short termist, where even 5 years is a long time or 5 days is a long time, that we're having to take and think of actions today to prevent an outcome in 2050. And again, that brings a very different mindset, a very different way of thinking, a very different culture almost. And I think those two aspects are two of the immediate kind of micro level roadblocks or challenges that I see out there.
I see a question from David Hunt, and I hope you can understand some of the acronyms here. He says, to achieve net zero financed emissions will require HSBC to finance at least some GHG negative businesses.
Yeah, greenhouse gas, yeah.
Okay. What do you see as the big GHG negative opportunities in the next 10 years? Do you expect these to be profitable customers, or will HSBC be financing them at a loss?
Without going into what I would say in terms of one of the biggest areas that if I go back to look at how any corporations manage the transition, they're going to have to be moving at a portfolio level because we need to be working with all of our clients to get there, and looking at it from the trade-offs of revenues, profits, climate in a very complex way. So David, that has a really important question. Now, some of the GHG businesses that you can think about around carbon capture, David, are going to be really important, and you're seeing the 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 technology and the capability of that coming out, even though, as you said, profitable business models are there. And that's why if you look at all kind of the kind of things about supporting clean tech and venturing and building investment in that way, that's the way in which you can see firms engaging via those things to drive cleaner technologies in that way. But David, you also make a really important thing, that getting to net zero isn't just about the technology dimension around, as I said, something like, say, a carbon capture business. Um, but there's actually also the way in which natural capital comes in. And you're hearing people, again, talking about biodiversity, building back forests and in the natural environment, that there's increasingly going to be looking not just at negative greenhouse gas businesses like carbon capture, but also increasingly how, as an organization, as societies, we look at the whole picture. You know, um, you know, um, you know, So, for example, Marcy, if you look in, say, Trinidad, one important part of their biodiversity, even around emissions, around mitigation, things like mangroves, and again, things which people, and mangrove vegetation, far less the kind of obvious things around rainforests and the Amazon, David, that you actually asked a profoundly important question. Yes, there will be a focus on greenhouse gas businesses and business models around things like carbon capture. The way in which you invest and finance that will be different, but there'll also be a need for, I think, wider solutions to look at, you know, going into aspects of natural capital.
Okay. I have a question here from Ashwin Joshi, who is the program director of our MBA. And he says, are there best practices in traditional manufacturing / resource extraction industries around climate ambitions and their fulfillment?
They know the development, and actually, if you look at the mining and metal and extraction industries, because they've had because the focus on those industries have been there earlier than most. And a lot, even if you look at a lot of the ESG investors have engaged earlier and more probingly with them, you can see within those sectors the better practices and the best practices already beginning to develop. And almost you, to some extent, I would, in getting the insights on those, is actually looking at the way in which they're they're talking about their ESG and their actions that they're already taking towards that. Uh, because it's that to some extent those industries that are most scrutinized to date because of their you know their carbon emission levels, okay, are some of those who've had to grapple with and be transparent about how they're addressing it and developing best practice. Yeah.
Okay, Alan, we have a number of students and prospective students actually in listening into the webinar. So this question comes from Nancy Sutherland, who works in the business and sustainability area at Schulich. So she's asking a question from a student standpoint, and she says, what advice would you give to a current student who is excited to work in this area about what they should be incorporating into their studies and their non-academic activities to make them the most prepared for the job market and maximize their success in this field?
I think having um if I can put it, give yourself the capabilities which allows you to do both the tree hugging and the hand-to-hand combat at the same time. Many of us come to, and I'm speaking, most of us come to climate change from a tree hugging bit of it, just because of the moral imperative of and the necessity to and the passion that we have for it. But when you go into a corporate world, there's some really hard trade-offs that need to be made. So the fact that we must get to net zero, I think, is non-negotiable. Just given the cost of us of what we can see now, and if we don't keep temperature rises beyond below the levels that we need to. But there's some really hard trade-offs that um, that need to be taken to get there. And I think building up the mindset, the curiosity, the capabilities to allow you to think about that is how I would look at that. Because I mean, we we're all very passionate. I am very passionate at it from a number of reasons. But as I said, really addressing climate change involves both tree hugging and hand-to-hand combat. And as we study, we need to be able to be equipping ourselves to do the hand-to-hand combat stage.
Okay, I'm going to go to another question. And this is from Charles Cho. I think he's going to be, this is going to go to your accounting background. Not sure if you can answer it, but Charles is a colleague of mine in the accounting area. He's also the Hawk Chair in Business and Sustainability. So he brings together accounting and sustainability. So he's asking, what is your take on recent developments in sustainability reporting? So we're coming from financial reporting kind of framing here. And the IFRS Foundation is wanting to set up a new standards board, which he calls reinventing the wheel, because we've had so many different kinds of reporting, GRI and so on. So, he's, asking, what is your take on that? Do you think, in new standards, another new standards board is going to help address climate risk issues?
I don't think a new standards will, but what I think is important and where it's going to. So on one hand, the accountancy bodies, and in particular the accountants who've contributed to greater disclosure, have already played an important role. I think what is going to be really important, and I think whether it's not so much a new standards board, but a new standard or maybe even guidelines, a lot of us in accounting are driven by historical data, whatever. So much of what we need to do and measure and assess around climate is forward looking, and actually for which there's not a lot of data. And so how do you bring that forward looking, those forward looking assessments and valuations into an accounting reporting framework as we've traditionally looked at it, is where some of the biggest challenges are going to be. And I think my view, if I were thinking, would not be a setting up a new foundation, but actually looking at those really essential building blocks of how we measure climate risk, how we disclose climate risk, which challenge some of the historical accounting principles and conventions. That is where I think there's a big need for the profession to be leading on.
Good answer, and good insight for us here. We've been having a lot of debates amongst ourselves. So back to the topic.
Gosh, you took me back. It took me deeply back into my accounting there. Kind of.
I know. I mean,
I haven't been there for a while.
I felt it was a bit of a curveball, and it might
No.
be a
Yeah,
bit of
as
a
I say,
risk.
you can take the man out of accounting, but you can't take accounting out of the man. So you carried me back.
So true.
Thanks for that, Charles.
And both you and Charles could relate to that, I guess. So this is a question from Naeem, and it relates to that scenario planning slide that you brought up. And Naeem asks, how reliable are scenario analysis results given the sensitivity to assumptions and the very long prediction horizon? So this is more of a technical kind of issue.
You know what? I think we have to realize scenarios are narrative. Scenarios, I don't know. We have to look at scenarios. I don't know if you ever watched some of those movies, those thrillers or horror movies where someone puts up they kind of film a movie and they said, if you're watching this movie, you know that I'm already dead.
Yes.
We have to look at scenarios. Scenarios are a way in which make us think how the future plays out. And actually, for a number of climate scenarios, you don't want them to be right.
Right.
Okay? What we know is that there are a number of different paths that can and will be taken for us to get to net zero. And we want scenarios to be helping us to think through that discipline in that way, rather than, and actually, but also to the nice point, to have that consciousness that there's no right scenario, but it's something which is driving our discipline to understand how can this next period play out. How do we understand the risk? How do we understand how our business model may or may not adapt? What is the scenario that we think is most likely, but also what do we use to choose it? So that is a really important question. There is no totally right scenario, and actually there's no scenario that ever should be right, but that does not preclude it being a really important tool, an essential tool to help us manage the risk.
So here's a question from Maya, and it focuses on the bank now and what you're doing at the bank. And it says, how does the bank, of course, Maya thanks you for the presentation. She asks, how does the bank coordinate execution towards the goals across emerging markets and the developed world with different portfolios and markets? Is there an international strategy setting and coordinating executive committee in addition to national ones? So it's a recognition that, there's certain amount of unevenness, and therefore, how does one execute a strategy in an uneven world? I think that's where Maya's.
It is, and Maya, one, actually, by acknowledging that is extremely difficult. But the two, there's some areas where it's completely consistent. One of the sobering things is that ultimately climate change is going to be profoundly democratic, i.e. it's going to affect all of us. So while it's affecting some poorer communities or countries more now, that ultimately there isn't a different science for me in London to somebody else somewhere else in the world, i.e., the fundamental things which are driving climate change, which is the way the level of greenhouse house gas emissions, which are at its root scientific, is common and consistent. So the data um, that drives those root bits of analytics that at least help identify the risks are consistent. So at the place where you can have those building blocks of complete consistency, you make sure that you get it there. And then to some extent, those other diversities between emerging and developed world, within the developed world, across different regulatory regimes, actually exist independent of climate. It's there already, So it's for those points that we can and must drive consistency, which is around having the scientific data really consistent. You try and build that building block, but then you also realize those that, again, in a emerging markets and in developed world, the period and nature of transition will need to take each of those into account. And again, it ties back it ties in with David's comment earlier, that even as we get to net zero, it's net zero overall, but the way in which different economies, different parts of the system, different customers, different clients contribute to that will be very different, even for reflecting the fact that emerging markets are at a different stage of development than the developed world, and that above all, that the transition has to be a just transition, that those places that have put more carbon and emitted more carbon into the world, that's caused the dislocation. It would be profoundly unjust to say, well, you don't develop as quickly, or you stay at a different stage of development, so that we all save ourselves together. And then part of that, again, coming back to your question, Maya, is recognizing that as we need to finance and get a just transition, to recognize the different ways in which climate is already impacting people differently.
Excellent. And there's the realm of politics that is going to intercede, and global action within the sort of international arena. I'm going to bring it back to actors, major actors, and Madhu asks, how do governments persuade the tech giants? Well, she says tech giants, but I know what she means here. She says tech giants such as Shell, Exxon, who are one of the major contributors to global warming, to adjust to new environmental norms, which can potentially disrupt their current business. What kinds of incentives?
I think they're coming without commenting on any particular client or customer. I would say actually some of the some companies are already doing it on their own. And actually, one company that I would call, because they've been very public with it, and actually they have some really interesting presentations, is actually BP. So about a month ago, BP brought out their strategy about how they will be transitioning towards renewables. And actually, if you have the time and you go to their investor web page, they not only have how they have their strategy, but even have some of their views of their scenarios that they're assuming of the world ahead. So on one hand, you actually have some boards of their own doing that, of kind of some kind of the energy majors, which I think is what Madhu's question is.
Yes.
On another one, you're already beginning to see investor and stakeholder action on it. And again, if you look at many of the oil majors and big companies, there've been a number of major investor resolutions prompting and probing those companies to articulate how they're addressing it, from that. Um, Another one is actually the market. And even if you look at even at last year's kind of full year financial results, quarter one financial results, a number of the a number of firms actually wrote down reserves, because I'm partly driven by COVID, okay, but also partly driven by the fact that if the change to a low carbon world happens, that there will be some reserves that have been valued and that would be extracted that may not be extracted to the same degree in the future. And again, it's interesting, again, if you go and look at those kind of year-end Q1, quarter one kind of 10K or investor disclosures where people have written down their reserves, the kind of, that you can begin to see the market beginning to come and play on that. And then even if I come back to government, the UK government's 10-point plan yesterday, and you can have a look at it, which points to the shift in 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 desired national energy mix for the decade ahead. Again, that's government, that's government pointing to where they see the energy mix in the economy going, and then influencing the debate. So I think, to your point, Madhu, it's happening. A number of companies themselves are already doing it. Investors and civil society are making them do it. Um, the market is already moving in that way. The market and actually the accountants when it comes down to writing the reserves, and governments, by the kind of change in fiscal policy, as I said, as exemplified yesterday.
Arnav, who, as I said, has been very active here, he asked an interesting question, and it's really going to put you on sort of risk here at
Yeah,
being a
if Zoom cuts out, that it's
well,
it's the wireless.
it's a bit of crystal balling. So he
Yeah.
says, out of these three scenarios, and I guess it was the early adoption, late adoption, no adoption, right? Out of these three scenario narratives, which one seems most achievable as of now? Or which one do you predict will happen?
I'd be an unwise man to predict, okay? I would say that before about a month ago, I would have said that the later adoption was more likely. I think following the election in the US and the signaling of the Chinese government's commitments towards net zero by 2060, that it brings it closer to an earlier adoption. You know, but again, you actually, and I've make a key point. Actually, the three scenarios are not the only narratives, and we need to be and that's at an international or global level that we're looking at. But at each and all national locales, those assumptions are going to have particular different nuances, and it's us beginning to think of our narrative. That's where, when I was mentioning the kind of BP's public in investor presentation, it's worthwhile having a look at their scenarios that they've put out of how they think the world will go, because again, it gives slightly different nuanced view on how we've just talked about it there.
Okay, so I see the questions are winding down. As I said, a lot of people are here and are thinking about jobs. So there is Sandeep asking, how does one become a climate consultant? How do you see the transition from an energy industry into consultancy? So I think Sandeep is telling us a lot about where he is and where he might want to go. And do you have any insights there?
I think it's going to be, I think in particular, as as this thing really embeds, and I think next year is where you're going to see it really coming out. The jobs that people are going to do in climate aren't yet created. I mean, actually, if I look at my job, this job didn't exist a year ago. You know, my job is the first created job of this kind to do it. Okay, um, in and but you can see with us and with other organizations, it's actually the need to invest in climate is going to be big, but it's going to be around capabilities. And actually, what you're going to find is that um, those capabilities that you would have from an engineering background, even if it's say being in a mineral extraction or fossil fuel industry, or some of the capabilities and skills that are going to be needed in the new world. So for example, going back even earlier to David's question on um, negative opportunities around carbon capture. Okay, what someone pointed out is that the same technologies or the same engineering capabilities that you'll need around carbon capture and storage, which is to dig pretty deep into the ground and, you know, are actually the same capabilities in reverse that you'd have needed to dig an oil well or mineral, you know, extract minerals. So again, that ability to have a capability which transfers into what the new industries around green are going to need are that. But actually standing back, and I guess there's always hope for us accountants. You're going to need, you know, even as we go to green world, you are going to need people to be doing the regulation, doing the law around climate change and green stuff, doing the accounting and evaluation. And it's building, and that's where kind of Schulich and its program is so important to understand how the capability needs as an accountant or as a lawyer or as a regulator in the new world is going to play out. I mean, the, there's a lot of things that what around what people are calling the green taxonomy. It's happening, but actually, which defines what is green and not green. It may sound really kind of mundane, but actually, that's going to be defining the rule of the games of the business that's done, what defines a product, what defines our accounting, what defines our legal contracts. And people who build up the understanding and capability in that, you know, and a lot of the emerging regulation that's coming out of that and then playing it back into day jobs and industry are those who are going to be ahead of the game and building themselves up for the capabilities, as indeed as someone who may have built in their capabilities in the engineering industry extracting, but then looking at how they flip it on its head to help build something around carbon capture and storage.
I think that's an excellent point about, you know, being able to dig deep, look at your skills and be able to have them pivot
Exactly.
into the new realities. We've got 6 more minutes left, and I see a couple of Canada focus questions, both
Yeah.
coming from Agent. I know you don't want to talk policy on Canada,
Yeah.
but it's you know, it is a reality
Yeah.
that we are a resource intensive economy. So Agent asks 2 questions. Let me see if I can sort of combine them. You know, the big broad question is what climate action strategies can corporations in Canada adopt? And there's another question that he asks about, you know, the fact that there are only 14 Canadian companies that have taken up science-based targets, and how can we spur more broad-based action? So the realities of our resource embeddedness, our resource dependency in Canada, and how do we grapple with the economy really versus.
It is, and I think it's really coming back down to the that idea of a just transition and corporations, civil societies, governments working and financial institutions working in a thoughtful and mature way to help move the transition. Um, it, at the end, it's understandable while people will challenge and have perspectives around um, companies as part of their process, you know, you know, will be carbon intensive in terms of their business models. But those are companies that provide real jobs to real communities, um, and actually have fueled a lot of the economic wealth of the country over a significant period. A- And and actually, in some cases, because of the challenge and the scrutiny that they've had previously, have had to address some of the issues already. And I think it's going and having some of those, engaging in a, a thoughtful way where, look, from we all are people driven by data and the science, and this is what the science is telling us, that if we don't address carbon emissions, um, we don't we're not going to have a world
There is no
that's working.
economy to save.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, given that, I mean, I won't say how old I am, but I can remember what I was doing 30 years ago, like if it was yesterday. And if you think that we have 30 years ahead to get this stuff acted on, when you engage with whoever it is to say, like, actually, how do we engage and take the actions in a thoughtful, responsible way to help address it? And that's where, going back to the earlier thing about taking the engagement and the discussion around transition from, from tree hugging to when I say not hand to hand combat, maybe the wrong analogy, but grappling around some of the real complexities is what I think comes next. And that's where I think a, a, a business school discussion, a forum like Schulich is so important, because it helps people to realize those real trade-offs, um, and make people then think about it in a grown-up way. Because in an economy like Canada's, where so much of the economy and jobs and wealth and so many of the bits of society that have come from those industries over decades, the country is what it is, built on how those corporations have done over the years. How the transition goes has to be just to all stakeholders within the community, including and in particular those communities whose jobs and livelihoods depend on it and have always depended on it. How do you build a just transition to whatever comes next? And I think that's how I think the debate has to go. And on that thing of science-based targets, I think what you are seeing is that major investors and the market are increasingly um, asking companies to disclose, to 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 engage around that, and it will soon become a matter of market forces. That if you aren't moving in that direction, your shareholders, your stakeholders, and actually increasingly your customers are going to be doing that. If I go back and look at our, if I go on my slide here, right, we talk about us becoming a net zero bank, okay, and then part of that is actually where we say net zero in our own operations and in our supply chains by 2030. That is us going to all of our suppliers and saying, oops, sorry, that's us going to all of our suppliers and saying, what are you doing so that when we know that when you provide services to us, that you are, that you yourselves are showing how you're going to net zero. And if you look at that, that's by 2030, that's not even 2050.
Yeah.
People are going to be having to be showing that, and it's going to have to be some kind of science-based target by which they articulate that, or else increasingly people will be having a different conversation around business, you know, and that's not us and our customers, because with our customers, who we have to have a much mature and thoughtful and supportive transition over net zero over the entire period. But with suppliers and those who supply to us, it's going to be a, how are you helping us to get there by 2030? And so to the extent that you're part of that supply chain, you're going to have to be showing, whether it's through a science-based target or through, this is what you're doing to help us to get there.
Wonderful. I want to thank Ajit for asking the question, because it sort of, gives us a nice way to end the session in terms of sort of situating the problem in a Canadian context, and then talking about what are our responsibilities as a business school, as business educators, and as business practitioners to realize some of these targets. So, Alan, I want to thank you. This has been an amazing session. For me, I have learned a lot. I started off from a very, very naive place, trying to even work out the difference between climate change and ESG. You could see the number of questions, the number of good questions that were asked. The dialogue was amazing. But of course, we are limited by the constraints of time. All of us are in different time zones. I know it's late in the evening for you. And I just want to thank you on behalf of all of my colleagues at Schulich School of Business, the students, the entire Schulich community, in fact, the entire York community, for what I thought was an amazing presentation. And I think to start our series this way is going to be a tough act for others to follow. So thank you, Alan. Thank you, participants. I thank you for your very, very amazing questions, and have a good day, a good evening, and a good night to you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure and privilege. Thank you very much.
Okay, so over and out.